The world has changed a lot in the last few weeks, and we may not yet know the full extent of what's unfolding. On March 11th, the World Health Organization officially declared the spread of coronavirus, or COVID-19, a pandemic. Outbreaks around the world have led to widespread lockdowns, closed borders, and a rapid slowing of economic activity. Financial markets have witnessed dramatic volatility, and financial institutions, central banks, and governments have all been put to the test. I'm Scott Martin from Deloitte Center for Regulatory Strategy, and you're listening to Regulated Radio. I'm happy to say that I'm joined today by two of Deloitte's most seasoned crisis fighters, David Strachan and Rick Cudworth, for this special working from home edition of our podcast. We'll be talking about how financial services firms are coping with the financial and operational challenges of the current circumstances, what regulators are doing to ensure that the sector stays stable during this time, and how executives should plan for the uncertainty of the long days to come. This has been an unprecedented time in all of our lives. We're all adjusting to a new normal, but this is still Regulated Radio. Events are moving very rapidly. Public authorities are announcing new actions and measures at a breakneck pace, and the public health crisis we're facing today is on a scale we haven't seen in just over 100 years. When you listen to this show, many of the facts or initiatives we speak about may well have evolved, but we still wanted to reach out from our home to yours to talk about the risks we're now facing, but also to talk about the resilience of the financial sector that so many of us worked so hard to build. And having said that, I'll waste no time in bringing in our first guest, a longtime friend of the show, David Strachan, the head of Deloitte's EMEA Center for Regulatory Strategy. David, welcome back.
Thanks, Scott. Very pleased to be with you and Rick today.
So a lot of people are comparing the COVID-19 crisis to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Now, David, you were the Director of Financial Stability at the UK Financial Services Authority during the last crisis. So I think it's fair to say that you experienced that crisis more directly than most. I'm wondering, how much similarity do you see between what happened in financial markets then and what's happening now?
Thanks, Scott. So, in short, I think I see more differences than similarities, but there are some. In the first place, and a big difference, I think, is that last time financial services firms, particularly banks, were at the core of the crisis. They were very much part of the problem, and in some cases, the root cause. However, when we look around today, largely as a consequence of the regulatory reform since the last crisis and the efforts that banks have made to build up capital and liquidity, we see a banking sector that is much more financially resilient this time than it was in 2008. 2009. And I think that makes a big difference when it comes to continuing to extend credit into the economy and to the borrowers who need it. The second difference was that in 2007, 2008, central banks, governments, regulators didn't really have a toolkit or a playbook to guide their actions. They had to create one over a period of hours, days, weeks, and months. And it was very much a process of learning by doing as events unfolded. However, having been through that experience, I think it stands the authorities in really good stead this time around. And you can see evidence of that in how quickly they've rolled out a series of very wide-ranging measures. And all that happened within a couple of weeks of the escalation of the pandemic and the authorities' response. But having said all that, inevitably, there will also be an element of learning by doing this time as well. The current situation that we're all facing will undoubtedly identify some new issues to which the authorities will need to respond at very short notice. And then the last difference, and again, I think it's a significant one. Last time, people were by and large all in the office. They were there together, very often 7 days a week. And that, of course, just isn't possible this time around. Now, how big a difference is that, given the advances in technology and our ability to communicate with one another from remote locations, remains to be seen. But I think as this episode unfolds, we'll begin to understand just how big a difference the lack of physical proximity makes to the response.
So, David, I take your point that the banking sector is in a much more liquid and better capitalized position today. But given that the world of modern finance has never really experienced a global pandemic on this scale before, how can regulators know that the sector really can withstand the shock when we don't have a benchmark to forecast what kind of economic damage it might do?
I think that's a very good question, and one that I would answer in the context of stress testing. And again, the changes in stress testing and the much more rigorous approach to stress testing that both banks and regulators have introduced over the last few years. Now, as our listeners will know, regulators have been conducting stress tests, usually on a sort of 1 year or 2 year basis, to look at the resilience of the financial sector, not only banks, but insurance companies as well. And if I move from the general to the particular, and look at what's been happening since in the market since March, the movements there have been very substantial indeed. Nobody can doubt that. But when you compare them with some of the parameters set out in the Bank of England's 2019 annual cyclical scenario for the largest banks, most of those market movements are still within those parameters. So, for example, equities, the Bank of England stress test had a 41% fall. The actual to date is around 25%. And if I look at the foreign exchange market, where the stress test had the sterling dollar spot rate falling by 30%, in the current environment, it's actually fallen by around 10%. So within the margins of the last stress test. What has been different is market volatility, and that so far has been higher than envisaged in the Bank of England stress test. The VIX peaked at a quarterly average of around 41 in the stress test, whereas in current market conditions it's been up to 85 and on average 49 in March. So volatility stands out as something that's been excessively what was envisaged in the stress test. But having said that, while market volatility and market risk are important, I mean, if you look at the balance sheet of the majority of banks, what really matters is credit risk. And credit risk, in turn, will be driven largely by GDP, by growth, by what happens to unemployment in particular. Now, the 2019 Bank of England stress test forecast a 4.7% fall in GDP. Although there's a risk of a significant GDP contraction in Q2 2020, and we're already seeing some signs of that, it's still at present possible that there may be a sharp rebound later in the year. Certainly that's what some forecasts are suggesting. But by and large at the moment, we don't know. It's too early to say. But that's going to be a key driver. Just to conclude the answer, Scott, I think what I would say is that all these observations emphasize the point that supervisors have a solid basis on which to say that banks are in a strong capital and liquidity position. There's significant uncertainty about the outlook, clearly, and there are characteristics unique to this environment that means that what happens next over the coming months could be very different from prior experience, not least a very sudden halt to activity and the very broad impact across the economy. For that reason, supervisors are monitoring banks very closely, and you can expect that monitoring to step up over the coming days and months.
Now, just speaking a little bit more about financial regulators and supervisors, they seem to have been making an endless stream of announcements recently on measures they're taking to help firms manage through the current crisis. David, when you see those measures, what do you think is most important for us to watch in all of this activity?
I would characterize the last couple of weeks as very much being the mobilization phase, during which central banks, governments, regulators have put in place a series of measures which, at their core, really seek to ensure that the supply of credit to the economy and to borrowers continues and isn't suddenly interrupted. From this week onwards, I expect that the focus will really move on to the delivery. And in other words, how are those facilities that have been put in place being used? Are borrowers making use of them, drawing down the credit that is made available under the facilities? And if there are delays or challenges to that, why is it happening? Is it because there is uncertainty on the part of borrowers leading to a lack of demand to access those facilities? Or is it because, for either operational reasons or otherwise, there are some hiccups in the supply? So I think that's going to be a focus. The other clear focus, and certainly reading the weekend's press, listening to media reports, there's now a great focus on financial services firms' treatment of vulnerable customers, whether those are individuals, whether they are corporates, potentially distressed corporate borrowers, and indeed on the insurance side, those with claims under insurance policies. And I think the financial services industry will need to make sure that it does everything in its power to look after its customers, but also to be able to respond quickly and decisively if problems emerge. So those are the two things I'd watch out for over the coming weeks.
All right. Now, one of the things that I remember the most about the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was the G20's really coordinated response to it. High-profile summits, forging of a really ambitious global agenda where previously there were areas that hadn't seen agreement. It seems that regulators are acting much more nationally or jurisdictionally this time. Do you think that's a fair observation? And if so, why do you think that might be?
First of all, I go back to my initial answer, Scott, which is if you compare what we're experiencing today with last time was very much a crisis which had the financial services industry at its core and indeed at its root cause. As we've discussed, we're in a very different situation today as we look ahead. So against that background, I think it's less surprising that the global regulatory bodies have so far been less evident. But to be fair on them, they are present. We've had statements from the Financial Stability Board, from IOSCO, from the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, and on Friday from the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which did indeed make a very important announcement, which in brief involves pushing back the deadline for implementing the final stages of Basel III by 12 months to the 1st of January 2023. So although they haven't been as prominent, as I say, as last time around, there's no doubt in my mind that they are present, and to the extent that further action is needed as the pandemic unfolds over the coming weeks and months.
All right, so just one more question for me about what we can learn from the last crisis, the global financial crisis. As everybody knows, That crisis was followed by a very long period of re-regulation, much of which we're still finalizing even now. But given all the talk of delays to major regulatory initiatives prompted by COVID-19, like you just mentioned, David, the Basel III finalization, in the longer term, as you think past this crisis, where do you see the regulatory pendulum swinging towards more regulation, or maybe a little bit less of it?
Well, the short answer to that is it's just too early to tell. Which, of course, I appreciate is not the answer that anyone particularly wants to hear at this juncture. But I think that's where we are at the moment. Just two more helpful observations, perhaps. First is we are seeing regulatory deadlines and timelines being pushed out. And that's absolutely right. But so far, we're not seeing very much that is being cancelled or abandoned. And certainly as we sit here today, that would be my prediction for the future trend. We'll see delays rather than cancellations. And secondly, I think what is clear is that before the current pandemic, regulators around the world were very fixed on improving the resilience of financial services firms and the financial system as a whole from an operational perspective. So we're learning a whole new vocabulary around operational resilience to complement financial resilience. And that agenda of operational resilience is going to see more attention, and there will, I think, undoubtedly, because of what we're experiencing, be more momentum behind it, particularly once we're over the peak of the current pandemic. So there, I would expect more activity. Now, whether you characterize that as re-regulation or more regulation, I don't know, but it will certainly, what we're experiencing today will certainly be a catalyst for action around operational resilience.
Okay, David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right, my next guest, Rick Cudworth, is the head of Deloitte's Reputation, Crisis and Resilience team, and he was last on the show in November talking about the operational resilience of the financial sector. Now, Rick, as you can imagine, has had his hands very full helping firms manage this crisis in the last few weeks, so I'm really glad he could make the time to join us today. Rick, it's good to have you.
Thank you, Scott, and it's great to be back and to join with David.
So, Rick, we've been saying for a while now that firms and regulators have been shifting their focus to strengthening the sector's resilience to major operational disruptions. Now, a lot of people have said that nobody expected this crisis, or much less the historic scale of it. So, in your view, has the financial sector done enough to prepare for this, or did it simply come too early?
That's a good question, Scott. I mean, there will inevitably be a lot of post-pandemic assessments of, whether enough had been done. That is bound to be happening once we get through through this. I think one thing is for sure, this risk has been top of the UK's national risk register for many years. So it's one thing, I think, recognizing the risk exists, but quite another to prepare for it. Having said that, financial institutions in particular have always been at the forefront of resilience and preparations for events or for things like this. Most financial institutions will have had a pandemic plan, although it may not have been as fully executable as they would have liked. I think David touched on it as well earlier. The challenge this time is we've moved almost overnight from what I would call a typical pandemic playbook of gradually escalating measures as you move up through the curve. The original government response plan here in the UK of contain, delay, mitigate effectively mirrored that sort of playbook. But overnight, we moved to a much more extreme set of measures, typically seen at the very peak of quite a severe wave, and the strategy moved to what we now term as suppression. And I think the speed of this change has caught many people out, at least initially. Again, I think, as David said, the banks in this case are not the cause of the problem, but they clearly can be part of the solution and are part of the solution. The big challenge now for them is going to be, being able to implement many of the government measures to support businesses, whilst at the same time looking after the safety of their people and vulnerable customers. The advent of home working for many is really making it possible to do so much more than say we would have seen possible during the H1N1 pandemic. And I think this is providing quite a degree of resilience in the system, which is interesting to see that work through.
So when you were on the show last November, you spoke about this new concept that UK financial regulators were developing called impact tolerance, essentially asking firms to set a tolerance for the degradation of their important business services in a crisis and then to keep to it. But I guess I'm wondering, since this regulatory framework isn't finished yet, is this concept of impact tolerance at all relevant for firms in the current crisis?
Firstly, what I would say is I do believe what is happening now will fundamentally change the thinking on resilience, at least in the sense of, for a time, it will become a strategic issue for many. And I think that will be a good thing. And we'll need to be ready to harness that. Having said that, I think much of what has been put forward by the financial regulators in their consultation papers will actually stand the test of time. There's no doubt that their focus on important business services, impact tolerances, and severe but plausible scenarios will endure, in my mind. Now, you specifically mentioned impact tolerances. I think at the moment there's a real focus on important business services. Understanding and meeting changing demands for those services is the first step. And many financial institutions will be well on the way to doing that. The interesting thing for impact tolerances will be the realization that customers are prepared to endure a level of impact. So, for example, we're already seeing, reduced service levels on call center services, reduced branch operations, providing they have an alternative means through, say, online services. Customers, I think, we're going to see are willing to tolerate a level of impact. And this will highlight as well the importance of substitution as a means of increasing overall resilience. So, they will tolerate an impact in one area, providing they can do it by another means. And I think that we're seeing that play out at the moment as well. And of course, this level of tolerance may be seen as unique to this situation where they don't regard financial institutions as being the cause of the problem, but again, something for us to look at in the future.
Now, everybody listening will know that we've seen a pretty significant shift in strategy by most governments recently, and you've mentioned this yourself, Rick, to one where we're essentially trying to flatten the curve, to slow infections of COVID-19 in order not to overwhelm our healthcare systems. Some people say this strategy will lengthen the lockdown period. So, Rick, what kind of scenarios do you think that, given this, financial firms should be planning for now?
So I think, we're still really in the response phase, and, most firms have now done their initial response. I recommend to many of the organizations I talk to that we now need to move to response phase 2. And this is about implementing the operational changes to ensure you can meet the changing demands, whilst maintaining the safety of your people and customers, adapting to an evolving situation over the next 3 to 12 months. And increase the resilience of what you've put in place already, because much of that has been put in place in haste. And I think making sure that it's sustainable, viable for a much longer period is going to be a key theme. Now, one way of doing this, you mentioned, Scott, there, scenarios. One way of doing this is to set out the changes you'll make and the actions you'll take against, I've termed it as 3 scenarios. Rising peak. So that's a situation similar to what we're seeing today in the UK and across much of Europe, sort of quite heavy suppression of the pandemic. Then a second scenario, which is post-peak. And that's a situation where we'll see some, but not all of the restrictions lifted. So continued emphasis on some forms of social distancing and working from home, but a relaxation nevertheless to enable more services to resume and more people to work. And then I think a third scenario to look at is post-pandemic, where we're into the first moves towards recovery, and recovery can start to be considered. So I would say to firms, be looking at those 3 scenarios over this next response phase, have clear actions you're going to take at each stage, understand when you're going to take them and how you will do that, and recognize that what we may do over the next 3 to 12 months at least is cycle between those 3 scenarios. We could move from the first scenario to the second scenario to the third scenario, and then potentially back to the second scenario, or even worse, back to the first scenario. So be prepared that we may have to cycle through those scenarios again. So the planning now will help with that flexibility.
But before this crisis, I think a lot of executives and regulators imagined operational disruptions to be short, sharp things. A cyber attack, an IT failure, a natural disaster. COVID-19, as you've been saying, is obviously a very fast-moving, but also a very protracted crisis. Is there a difference in the kind of business continuity and operational resilience measures that firms have to take for really long versus short disruptions?
Yeah, I think, Scott, what you say is true to an extent, though we've always talked about true crises as having a long tail. So I think a really big crisis inevitably always does have a long tail. But what we do need to recognize, and I think it would be optimistic of people to talk about moving into recovery within the next 3 months. If we do, that's going to be great. The reality is, I think we're in multiple phases of response before we can fully move into recovery. And that is slightly different to many of the scenarios we've seen before, where it's initiated by one sudden event, that event finishes, and we're just trying to then move through a longer tail of recovery. This one will have multiple response phases. I think that is a big difference. And that's why I talk about the 3 objectives in planning against the scenarios that I mentioned earlier as being, first and foremost, safety. How do I maintain the safety of my people, my customers, during that period of change? Second, how do I make sure I've got the flexibility I'll need to go from one scenario to the other, to implement the actions as the government response changes? And thirdly, how do I make sure I have the resilience in place to keep the operation sustainable, viable through that period? So again, I come back to that is different, but it needs to be dealt with firm, if you like, resilience planning mechanisms.
So I'm conscious that when this is all over, there's going to be a lot of looking back and taking lessons from this crisis, particularly when it comes to how we design the financial regulatory framework. And one of the things that we discussed last time you were on the show is that firms have to be prepared to deal with severe but plausible scenarios, but not necessarily extreme scenarios. So I'm wondering, is the COVID-19 crisis, in regulatory terms and in your view, a severe but plausible crisis? And does it set the benchmark for what financial firms might need to show that they're ready to deal with going forward?
Yeah, I think, Scott, a pandemic is certainly plausible and was certainly plausible. As I said right at the outset, it's been top of the National Risk Register published by the government for many years. And the National Risk Register has always indicated that a pandemic would have the highest potential impact on the UK. So with this in mind, I think it is one that organizations should be prepared for, should have been prepared for. Otherwise, why have a national risk register? So, in my view, in general terms, a pandemic is therefore a severe but plausible scenario for sure. However, in this particular case for COVID-19, the government's response has had to move more quickly than might have been envisaged, as I said again earlier, particularly more quickly than envisaged in a typical pandemic flu. So I think the question for regulators will be whether, when they look back, they would see this particular situation as severe or extreme. I think regardless, in my view, preparation should always consider a reasonable worst case scenario. So there's some flexibility in the response. And I think that should be part of the emphasis that they consider and look at.
All right, Rick, thanks a lot for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Scott.
And there you have it, 2 of our expert views on one of the biggest challenges the financial sector may ever have to face. One thing I've taken away from the conversation with David and Rick today was just how many different parts of the modern financial regulatory system are being put to the test at this very moment. We've spent a decade building resilience since the global financial crisis, and now that resilience is what we most surely need. Now, I'm happy to say that regulated radio is going to continue from our homes during the course of the lockdown, so we can keep talking about exciting regulatory trends in finance. So remember, if you like the show, hit the subscribe button to ensure you receive notifications about our next episode. And if you're already subscribed, you can give us a review on your platform of choice or email us with your thoughts at regulatedраdio@deloitte.co.uk. We would love to hear from you. I want to thank the Deloitte marketing and creative staff who did such a great job of finding a way for us to keep recording despite everything going on. And I want to wish you and your families all the best during these uncertain times. But that's all for now. Thank you so much for joining us, and you'll hear from us again soon.